Techniques we discuss here are meant for licensed wildlife professionals. If you aren't licensed and trained for wildlife rehabilitation, do not attempt to capture, hold, or rehabilitate any wild animal. If you find an injured wild animal, a wildlife professional can recommend next steps. Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation, Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buell. We'll tackle topics about rescue, care, management, reconditioning, and releasing wildlife found in North America. This is a deep dive into each subject. We hope to give rehabilitators information they can use because they're already going to great lengths to rescue and nurse animals back to health. An injured or orphaned wild animal's journey to restored health and independence in their natural habitat is delicate and complex. We draw techniques and expertise from many disciplines. Many animals brought into rehabilitation cannot be saved. The last gift we can give them is humane euthanasia. We will talk more about when this is necessary. Sometimes animals are deemed non-releasable and evaluated to be suitable for a life in captivity. When that happens, we shift to a long-term approach to managing their care, training, and housing. Some such animals serve as ambassador animals, a term for the animals that rehabilitators use to educate the public. Each episode will speak with experts who represent specialty topics across the profession of wildlife rehabilitation, ambassador animal care and management, showcasing best practices. Welcome back. This is the third segment of my in-depth discussion with the Nashville-based wildlife rehabilitator Debbie Sykes. In this episode, Debbie walks us through how her program assesses incoming white-tailed deer fawn and what are the criteria for accepting animals into her rehabilitation program versus euthanasia, which is sometimes the most humane thing we can do. After that, we discuss husbandry, an overview of managing, feeding, and conditioning animals for release. Let's dive right in. So let's say that you've been on the phone with somebody and you determine that you're pretty sure that this is an orphan and needs to come in, or maybe it's injured, right, and needs to come in. So it is come through the door. Now what?
It really depends on the situation. So since Walden's Puddle was a larger center, we had quite a few restrictions. We had a very low success rate with fawns that were under 3 pounds. We had tried colostrum, right? We know that babies in that first 24, 36, 48 hours have the specialized cells in their gut that gets the antibodies from their mom through the colostrum. It soaks into those antibodies or soaks into the stomach cells and goes into the bloodstream. So if they, those cells close, they stop absorbing at one point. And after that point, there's really, they're kind of screwed for the next 21 days. They don't have the right antibodies to help fight off disease. We're at a wildlife rehabilitation center that sees so many sick animals. There's like poop on the floor every day, even though we're cleaning it up. So in those cases, if they're under 3 pounds, we did choose to euthanize because the alternative was just watching them die. We couldn't provide the care that we needed. So for the younger guys, we did have to make that tough decision, which is very difficult because like we talked about, they are the most precious things. They are cute. They lick your face. And so, yeah, it was always hard to do. If they're healthier, it's a little bit easier. Just like with any orphan animal, we would give them fluids, give them a shot of B, just assess them, of course, beforehand. And if there were injuries, it really, give me an example of an injury, I guess.
A fractured leg.
Okay. Also, this is just going to be a really depressing talk. So again, we were a center that saw about 75 to 100 deer a year. We had tried amputations many years ago. So back in 2012, 2013, wasn't great. We did end up releasing some, but none of us felt good about it. So we don't, if it's an amputation situation, we generally don't. Depending on the year, the time of year, if it's later in the season and we're full, if they do have a fractured leg, we generally don't put them into the rehab program just because we have to have a certain limit. Like we talked about with the social situations with them, they're very small groups. So if we have too large of groups, then we put stresses on them and that can cause a lot of issues in rehab. Right. So we keep very small numbers because that's all we can afford at our facility, right? So space is a resource for us. We have a certain amount of space for white-tailed deer. We just have to make sure we stay in that space.
Right. And you mentioned that amputations just have never really worked, and you wouldn't, at this point, at this juncture, if you had to amputate a fawn's leg, you just wouldn't do it. It would be better to euthanize. So is that because and I'm a proponent that, everything on an animal is used for something. Yeah. So if you need 4 legs, you need 4 legs. But yes. Is it just that they really don't ambulate? I mean, they certainly can't ambulate as well as a fully functional animal.
And who knows what just like with a bird, who knows arthritis as they get older. We see that with dogs. Why wouldn't we see that with deer or fawns?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got a healthy fawn that's come in. Mm-hmm. Let's say it's over 3 pounds. So this is at a level that you're like, we think we can go forward with this. Mm-hmm. So what's next?
And again, it is going to depend on how busy our facility is. So let's assume medium size. We keep them in quarantine for about 72 hours. This is something we got from Wildlife Center of Virginia. We'll deworm them proactively, so panicure. And after 72 hours, we'll do a fecal. The reason we want to keep them quarantined is Cryptosporidium was an issue for us at our facility, just another parasite that they can carry. It causes bloody diarrhea. We didn't lose a lot of fawns to it, but it does spread very quickly. So you end up having to isolate quite a bit. But we'll generally keep them. So let's say we get 2 fawns in a day, even if they're from separate moms, we'll keep them together. They are very social. And this is one of the ways we prevent them from habituating to humans, is we give them something else to habituate upon. So they'll stay in quarantine together. And once they have cleared, so let's say they test negative, and again, remember that coccidia is part of their natural system, but we won't, of course, see that on a 3-pound deer. But then we let them into a small group. We'll keep groups of 4 or 5 per room. And that's, again, very important because any type of stress can upset their whole physiology, just like any orphan. You don't want to put 12 squirrels together. You want to keep them in their natural family size, that group of 4, 4 to 6. But we keep them in very small groups, and that's where they stay their entire stay.
Okay. Past quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
Now what? So I've been in quarantine for 72 hours if I'm the fawn. Yeah. And now I'm going to you mentioned they're separated into rooms. So mm-hmm. Is that indoors, outdoors? Is it like a barn? Is it like, what kind of facilities?
Just because, again, this is our setup. We didn't have money to build anything other and just use what we had. So we did keep them indoors. We had 2 to 3, sometimes 4 indoor rooms that we could use. They mm-hmm. were essentially the size, a little bit bigger than a bedroom.
Okay.
Well, probably about the size of a bedroom. And
10 by 10, 12 by 12 feet, something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
So you had 4 rooms.
Yeah. Okay. 4 rooms, 4 to 5 deer. And just like with any orphan, we transition them onto the formula. We start with just a goat electrolyte, And I did a lot of research on the different formulas that are out there. They've done some different studies, and it turns out it doesn't exactly matter what you use as far as when we're talking about like the protein to fat ratio. As we transition them from the goat electrolyte to the formula, I did a lot of research as far as what is the best formula to use for fawns. We know that deer milk is not like sheep, goat, cow milk, obviously. We did fawn lac and we cut it with doe's match replacer.
Okay, so just before we move on, fawn lac and who makes those products?
Great. Pet Ag makes the fawn lac. And the reason I like that, I'm a huge proponent of probiotics based off of a lot of the studies that they've done in humans and dogs. I mean, they found even in mice, there's a special flora in their gut that when you take it out, if you put them in water, they'll drown. If you put it back in, they'll like swim across. So I really feel like probiotics are important. I use fawn lac for that purpose. It supposedly has probiotics more geared towards deer. However, if you read the studies of what is in a deer's stomach, you'll find it's a little bit different than what they provide. There's nothing that I have found on the market to match what is found in a wild deer stomach, though. So we just like with every orphan animal, we do tend to make some sort of compromise there, but I still like to use that more for them. But doe's match is Land O'Lakes. Oh. And that's a little bit more, there's not a whole lot of nutrition in there. It's not nutrient dense like deer milk is. So that's why I like to include the fawn lac, since it's specifically designed for fawns. But then they also have Fox Valley out there as well.
And then have you ever used goat's milk?
We did, yes. That was also a poop show. But
meaning that there's a lot of diarrhea?
It's a double entendre. So are you talking about raw goat's milk straight from the goat, or are you talking about on the shelf goat's milk?
Whatever, probably on the shelf goat's milk. Maybe.
Okay, we did try. We asked people to bring in milk from their goats and we froze it. And then there's too many different variables there because you have to be able to trust the farmer and different things like that. But we did try it. And this is a little bit of history as to why I did so much research on white-tailed deer prior to 2018 or about 2018 and prior. We had a very low success rate in fawns, and it would get worse and worse each year. It usually happened as they went outside. Yes, we had fawns that would kind of die all along, but once they got outside, we thought they were doing fine. They'd start to develop lesions, and then the whole herd would just start to get really sick. And as a result, we had state veterinarians come out, the zoo veterinarian, they put on their hazmat suits. We did necropsies, sent them out to state and to the wildlife. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And essentially everything was inconclusive. I found an article about another center that had very similar issues. Their deer had similar lesions, and it seemed to be husbandry related issues. And we looked specifically into how can we fix the husbandry just by looking at their natural history. And so we did, throughout the years, we tried a bunch of things along with the formula. So trying goat's milk, raw goat's milk, doe's match, trying to use different types of formula. Ultimately, they all would still die. And so I have found that standing alone, the formula is not going to make or break fawn if you have bad husbandry, just like any other animal. But as far as what I have found, fawn lac is a very good high quality product because it's so expensive. That's why we would mix it with the dose match.
Okay. So it kind of stretches that, stretches it a little bit, but still does the job that it needs to do. So
yeah. And we found the fawns looked good. There were other factors along with it, the nutrition, but ultimately they looked good.
Okay, excellent. So let's stick with the feeding and that kind of, kind of the orphan piece to it before, and then let's get into that husbandry piece and management. So how often, and I know this depends, but maybe you can tell me what you base it on. In natural history, we talked about that a doe may not come to feed for maybe 12 hours and maybe only feed twice, maybe 3 times in a 24-hour period, maybe. So how do you figure out how often you're going to feed? Maybe you could talk just briefly about stomach capacity when you're trying to figure out how much to feed, and then like stimulating them to, urinate and defecate and all of those kinds of things.
Yes, when it came to feeding them. So the number of feedings was a lot of trial and error, but I don't say that like we fed them twice and they all die. I say that like we tried feeding tiny ones 4 times a day and they just didn't take as much as they did when we fed them 3 times a day. So some of the smaller ones, the 5-pounders, we would do about 3 times a day, but we would notice they'd kind of not take as much in that middle feeding. So we would take that out. And as long as they were growing, they looked healthy, we were monitoring all of those different things as we were either lowering or adjusting the food intake. We did used to try to do, they can only have 5%, limit them at 5%. And we had a pretty long history there, but we found that they do better. We just didn't limit them. We didn't find that any of them overate.
So they're not like raccoons, is what you're saying.
I mean, even our raccoons, we stopped limiting them and they did great.
Okay.
Yeah. So we didn't have to deal with diarrhea or anything like that. And same thing with fawns. We would, as long as they looked good, we would maintain them on twice a day. But again, it wasn't just something that I can say like, oh, we did it for 5 pounds and under. You really have to watch your animal, make sure that they're hydrated, make sure that they're gaining weight, that they look good. Just taking a step back. How are they acting? Is this a good plan, or do we need to increase their calories?
With orphans, like if I've got a young squirrel, it's really easy for me to weigh that animal every feeding before I feed it. Are you weighing?
Oh my God. We would try on their intake. We usually would weigh ourselves and hold them. Mm-hmm. After that point, it is just you don't want to habituate the animal, so you don't want to be picking it up if you don't need to. Mm-hmm. But you can generally just body condition score. Same thing that you would with a dog or horse or sheep, making sure that, they look good, they're eating, and again, taking a step back. And even if an animal gains weight every single day, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're thriving and doing good. There's so much other factors that go into it. Mm-hmm.
So as far as that formula is concerned, do you make sure you mix it right before you feed it? Do you do it in 24-hour batches? How does that work?
What I've found that works really well. So just like with any formula, if you vigorously mix it, you want to let it sit, at least 15 minutes to let the bubbles go to the top. I mix it with very hot water. So not quite boiling. Obviously, you don't want to like denature anything, but as hot as you can make it to where 15 minutes later, after all the bubbles have rose, 30 minutes later, after all the bubbles have rose, it's lukewarm. So that was usually how we did it. And, same thing, tested on our wrists just to make sure. We have found there's a preference. They do not like to drink cold milk. They do like it lukewarm. So that was our thing.
Okay. And so what kind of bottles did you use?
We used regular baby bottles, and I say regular, there's like 800 kinds of them. The kind that you can buy a 5-pack on Amazon for $5, like the Gerber colored, they're green and blue and pink and yellow. And those were good for color coordinating for groups. So each group got their own bottles and nipples, and that was very helpful. And with the nipples, it was the rubber ones. We would cut little X's in them, so they do kind of bite down. And so if you just do like a slit, sometimes that will cut the supply off. So we made sure to do an X so that when they bit down and suckled, they would still get formula.
And they were the regular nipples that came with the bottles?
Yeah.
Or like a sheep or goat nipple?
No, at one point we were thinking about that, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter. They ate it, and you know, we thought, oh, maybe if we get the sheep nipple, all of our deer won't die. But, you know, that definitely was not the main issue. So we did not try that. We decided to try some other things first. And as it turns out, yeah, the nipples, as long as they eat from them and it doesn't cause any issues, which these did not, they worked well.
Did you ever have trouble getting a fawn to accept this funky tasting formula? Because it's not deer's milk, right?
You know what's so interesting is I think after I started going to the classes that you and Melissa and Jackie taught, I became a better fawn feeder because I started to read their body language. You know, you're going through a very stressful day. You have 500 animals to feed yourself and take care of. And it's hard to stop and watch the animal and see like how you need to adjust. But the ones that were really stressed out, I found that if I kind of altered my body language, fed them from behind instead of like in front of them, and I didn't talk and really just read their body language, it helped a lot. So behavior, I think, plays a lot into it. But then on top of that, we also did stimulate, very similar to what the mom would do when she would go to feed her fawns, right? She stimulates them each time. And that sometimes helped as well. But I found that
we got to back up here for a second. If you're stimulating like mom does, wait.
Yeah, I lick their genitals. Yep. So we use, and it depends. Everybody was different. We do not suggest washcloths just because they're so rough. We would sometimes use our gloves and kind of wet it in warm water and do it that way, just making sure to soak it up with a towel or something like that. And each fawn is different. So you'll find some fawns like to be fondled different than others.
Oh, I love it.
But yeah, terry cloth, something gentle that can, you know, mimic that pretty well and make them feel a little bit safer.
Okay. So you're doing that while you're feeding. So you've got a bottle on one end and you're stimulating with your other hand?
It just depends on the fawn. So if they're not eating, yeah, sometimes I try it at the same time. If it's the first feeding of the day, you're not going to be able to hold 4 fawns back while you stimulate and feed each one. So we usually would stimulate them only if they weren't eating, but then we would stimulate all of them afterwards. Okay. We were at one point having to change their bedding 2 to 3 times a day to prevent that strong ammonia smell. Mm-hmm. But after taking Wildlife Center of Virginia did a fawn talk, and they talked about how they stimulated them during each feeding. And we're like, oh yeah. And sure enough, we didn't have to change the bedding as often. So.
Oh, that makes sense, right?
Yeah. Because they're not yeah.
And
that's even not just the tiny guys. We did it with anytime they were inside, we were stimulating them. So.
Oh, okay. So, so you're stimulating them either during or maybe definitely right after when you were feeding. Did you have, I'm going to go slightly off formula right here, but did you have like one caretaker per group, or what did you do as far as staff or volunteers? What did that look like?
Ideally, we did. So when our protocol was at its finest, I would say, what is it, June or July, that we get kind of a slight break from squirrels and opossums where we're able to do that. Yes, we had one person per group. When we didn't, we made sure to at least have each group had their own booties and apron, gloves, just to make sure you're not like stepping in their poop and then stepping into another room to potentially contaminate them. So, yeah.
Okay. So PPE. And then were there we were talking earlier about socialization, that if they're habituating or socializing with each other, there's less likely to socialize on the human, even when you're feeding them. Is that what you found?
I mean, people suggest like dressing up and covering yourself, but they can smell you. They're very visual. So we didn't talk to them. We weren't talking while we were in the room. It was just kind of a quick operation. Go in, get them fed, stimulate them. If you need to change their bedding or whatever, do that, take the food out, and then come back and bring the food in. So just not interacting with them as often, trying to keep it to that 2, maybe 3 times a day thing, they would congregate together for sure. And I mean, you want to keep in mind, like, we're not starving them. So they're full, they're happy. They're not like a cat at dinner time trying to get us to get them food. So.
Right. Okay. And then because there's a lot of different techniques for this, but you're feeding them individually, because there are some systems where you come in with a bucket that has milk in it, and then there's nipples on the outside of the bucket, and then they all go and suckle off the bucket.
Yeah, we did do bottle racks, and it would usually be some fawns took to it immediately. Most of the fawns, it would take 4 to 5 days to get on the bottle rack. Once they were pretty much on the bottle rack, then we would put them outside.
Okay. So that you did that transition then. It's like that each get bottle fed, and then you transition them to a bottle rack.
We try to work them towards the
right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Excellent. What am I forgetting about that part? Anything?
We would also supplement with food, so it wasn't just formula. I don't know if we're ready to jump into nutrition yet, but that would be the other part of it.
Okay, so we'll definitely talk about that when you start putting out that extra nutrition here in a second. So their age wasn't as much a determinant of when they were going to be moved, transitioned outside, as it was kind of the behavior, right? The behavior of the whole group. We're all feeding from the bottle rack.
And not, yes, correct. Yeah. So once everybody was on the bottle rack, they would go outside, because we could adjust the feeding times as needed. The other thing that I will say about feeding is, since they are crepuscular, we had 5 time a day, 4 time a dayers, 3 time a dayers, 2 time a dayers, and 1 time a dayers, all the different orphans in our facility. We would adjust that to when they're most active. So these guys were getting fed ideally in between the orphans that needed 5 time a day and 4 time a day. So even though they were only getting 2 or 3 time a day, we were trying to get them fed first, like one of the first animals to be fed at our facility, as close to 7 as possible. And then also very late at night, just to, again, mimic their natural history.
Right. And you did mention one of my very favorite words, crepuscular.
Crepuscular. Yeah.
I know. So for everybody that may not know, crepuscular is active at dawn and dusk.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of in between times between diurnal, which is daytime, and nocturnal, which of course is referring to being active at night.
Yeah.
So thank you for saying that.
Yeah. And they seem to be more active at the duskier part than the dawnier part. So.
Okay.
At least I say it's speaking in Tennessee. I don't know. I know with you guys, it depends on the seasons.
Oh, yes. Yes. And snow or no snow, and all of those kinds of things. But fawns, yes, I think fawns are a lot more active at dusk too. Excellent. So let's maybe jump into nutrition. And then, ooh, she's got a big smile on her face for that. And then I do want to make sure we talk about husbandry and like what the indoor rooms looked like as far as what kind of bedding and those kinds of things. And then the same thing for outside, and then what you are doing for what you do for release and what that looks like. So, but let's talk about nutrition, because this is, when I saw your talk at NWRA, I was just absolutely on the edge of my seat. Listen about nutrition. It was amazing. So let's talk about nutrition for white-tailed deer.
I would say this is like one of the biggest epiphanies I had, because while we were feeding them, as we had those very low success rates, it was very, get them honeysuckle vine, grapevine, maple, and we just cut everything down from the trees. But then when you go and you watch them in the fields, they're eating, they're doing a lot of grazing. And if you think about babies, when they're laying down and they start to nibble on things, it's on the ground. It's not necessarily they're choosing like honeysuckle or different things like that. So I talked to some of the hunters and the field biologists, and that's where I found a lot of this information. I couldn't find it. There was one book in particular that I'll recommend later, but that fawns need about 20% protein as they're growing. And if you look at the plants that we were feeding them, they were very low, like 13%. And that was the majority of what we were giving them. And you'll find that a lot with the browse. But what you find is that forbs, so plantain, clover, chicory, things like that, they have a lot of protein. One of the things that we did that I think just made such a huge difference was we grew our own forbs and chicory, just to make sure that we could meet those needs. And not only that, but I did incorporate some actual dirt. One of the studies, and actually maybe this was information that I got from University of Minnesota, the ruminant program or whatever you guys have. They had a whole ruminant discussion thing that I was looking on at the time. But since babies, fawns, don't have all these microorganisms because the formula is going past the four-chambered stomach, how do they get those, right? They speculated that they get them through the dirt and different things like that. So we offered some actual dirt while we grew the forbs. And so we grew them in black trays, small black trays that we could feed them. And we also grew them outside in their enclosures, which I know we'll talk about later. Okay, but I have a lot of really cute videos of them like trying it for the first time. So nibbling it a little bit as they're laying down, or like nibbling it and then getting excited and jumping all around and then nibbling some more. So, but I mean, I definitely can say, and it's hard to say because we did change a couple of different things at once, but as far as nutrition is concerned, that was the main thing we changed. And I believe it made such a huge difference. And a lot of the fawn talks that I had been to before really pushed browse, but again, those aren't very high protein. The caveat, of course, is there can be too much of a good thing, just like feeding a hawk only liver. That's not going to be good for them. Feeding them only high amounts of protein is not going to be good for deer and fawns as well. They do need the browse. They still need a boatload of browse, unfortunately, but
because you had to go out and have to go get it.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So how long did it take you to do some of that research, kind of figure this?
I would say like 1,000 hours, but that's encompassing everything. So about 1,000 hours for everything. This I don't know, because it was such an exciting rabbit hole for me that I didn't clock the number of hours for this. I mean,
why was it exciting? Why? What did you just like said, oh my gosh, this is this is the thing. I want to follow this protein rabbit hole, or I'm finding out new information I've never known before.
Yeah. Well, I did microbiology and infectious disease in college. And so this is kind of along the same lines. Like, how do we care for, we're not necessarily caring for the deer, we're caring for the microflora. That's the biggest thing. And so how getting to figure out how to do that is, it's what I studied. So.
Right. And even now, in human studies, they've been talking about, a lot of our gut flora, how important it is. It's almost like the quote unquote second brain in our bodies. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah. And my job, I work underneath a veterinary behaviorist as a behavior technician. And one of the things we always now recommend for dogs with behavior issues is probiotics. They've done studies, Purina's done so many studies on how probiotics can affect behavior. So, I take one every day just to make sure my mood stays great. And I just think they're so great. Probiotics for everybody.
Here's probiotics for you.
And I will note on that with deer, when it's in their formula, if you think about it, because of that reticular groove, it passes through that stomach, the rumen and the reticulum where all the flora is. So we also would give it to them orally. So they'd kind of get it in a way. So we'd foster the gut and the ruminal-reticulum.
So that's a really, really good point. So what kinds of probiotics are you using?
At first we were using great ones, and then our budget did not allow. Normally they recommend at least a 90-day course of probiotics. So it's not something you can just give once and expect it to make a huge difference. So we would kind of give it throughout the time. Mm-hmm. I did a little bit of research. Again, there's nothing on the market that really matches it. We used probiotic plus paste. And that was, I think it's geared towards goats. But again, when they did that study of goat milk versus deer milk, you found deer milk is way more nutrient dense. So the probiotics found in their gut is also completely different as well. So I just tried to find some that were related to bacteroides. I tried to stray from, what am I thinking of? The one in yogurt. That's everything.
Lactobacillus.
Yeah, lactobacillus. That's not one of the main ones that are found, but it's so hard to not find those. But they do make, if you get into like the deer farm black market, they're very secretive, but they do sell some that are a little bit more geared towards fawns, a little bit better for fawns.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. More on nutrition than that we're missing.
Yeah. Well,
we could go on and on, right? But
and it depends. So everything changes in the seasons. That's one of the things that I think is really important. And this is going to be Tennessee, the Southwest. I know it's so much different for y'all out in the Midwest, but for us, we're looking at, in the spring, it's going to be a lot of the forbs and the woody browse, a little bit of grass. And then as we get into summer, the grass kind of disappears, just like with horses, again, like it doesn't taste as good. And you're going to see way more woody browse, way more forbs. But then as we go into fall, the browse and the forbs shrink because it's not available in the environment. The mass increase. So making sure we're giving them lots of acorns and different types of, small amounts of fruit, but a lot of that fattier stuff, because that's what's going to help them survive winter time. So right where up until they're with us, and I don't know what the laws are for y'all, but usually we have to release ours the first week of the hunting season opens. They're with us until, into fall. So we need to make sure that we are helping them survive that first winter.
This was part 3 of my in-depth discussion with Debbie Sykes about rehabilitating white-tailed deer fawns. For the next and final segment of our talk, we cover more about husbandry, including best practices in building optimal enclosures. Light, temperature, native plants, and types of fences are all critical for a good outcome for fawns. We'll wrap it up with some of Debbie's thoughts on the value of wildlife rehabilitation as a career. Hope you'll tune in. This was another episode of Wildlife Rehabilitation Rescue to Release. We're glad you joined us today. Wildlife Rehabilitation Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buell. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. Our producer is Kirk Clockey. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, visit raptor.umn.edu. Are you interested in becoming a licensed wildlife rehabilitator? Visit the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association website at nwrawildlife.org for resources to get started. And remember, if you do find an injured or orphaned animal, please contact a licensed wildlife rehabilitator in your area. And that's our show. Hope you'll join us next time.